Nick, you were controller Radio 3 and also you ran the Proms. But you didn't read music at university, I think you read history. So I'm interested in how your musical tastes developed. Was there a lot of music at your school?
Well, St Bede's, which was a very fine Catholic grammar school in those days and still is, had no academic music of any kind. So music at St Bede's and music at school, as far as I was concerned, was singing Gilbert and Sullivan, which I hugely enjoyed and was probably the peak of my performing career. Patience, Impatience, and Iolanthe and Iolanthe. So there was a gap between St Bede's and Balliol where I went to Cheadle Hume School specifically to do A-level music because I'd by then done a lot of music on the side but had no qualification. So I did, as you did in those days, Oxbridge entrance after doing A-levels, plus A-level music, and then I went to Balliol. But I must say, I do not regret at all not having read music at university. You know, I might have ended up with six-part counterpoint coming out of my ears, but I think it's one of the things that's enabled me to retain my enthusiasm for it. I used to go and work in the music faculty library when it was still next door to the Holywell music room.
This is in Oxford, of course, and I think Jack Westrup was Professor of Music at that time.
My one memory of Jack Westrup is 1971 must have been the student occupation of the Clarendon building in belated response to the, stuff of the time. Yeah. And I was in the music faculty library and Jack Westrup came up those wooden stairs and he looked round at the library and he said, "I've just seen a posse of policemen go into the Clarendon building." He said, "I only came up here to say posse. It's a wonderful word, isn't it?" And off he went.
But you presumably played an instrument.
Yes. By that point, I had played for a while the cello in the Stockport Youth Orchestra, but I had switched from the cello, being a bit of an individualist and not wanting to be one of 12 cellos, I switched to playing the bassoon, where you were only one of two. But by the time I got to Oxford, I was A, conscious of the fact that I wasn't very good at either of them, and B, I had just started to write about music, so I was doing more criticism, for Isis and Charwell than I was. But I put on some concerts, a couple of concerts in the Holywell Music Room, and there was a lot of music going on at the Catholic chaplaincy, where I spent a lot of time and met my wife there. So it was music was always around, but it was never the thing I did apart from anything else. I think I thought music was going to be my great hobby in life.
Presumably at home you'd been listening to music on the BBC. How had your musical tastes developed?
I think they had developed chiefly through church choir. So I absolutely had the sort of bedrock of Byrd, Tallis, the English Renaissance. Those are the things that I'd participated in. And my parents, who weren't particularly musical, but they were always very supportive and very enthusiastic, they tended to listen to the lighter end of the BBC. So there was always music around in the house, but I wouldn't say that we were, they weren't concentrated third programme listeners, for instance. That was something that developed very gradually. So I think this thing of how one's taste is formed is absolutely fascinating. And I think in my case, looking back on it, it was the influence of people that I got to know through music summer schools that I went to, courses that I participated in. There was a wonderful music week at a place called Spode House near Rugeley, where people like George Malcolm and Robert Sherlock Johnson would come. That was where I heard and got very excited by Messiaen for the first time. So those were the exciting things.
George Malcolm, of course, had been at your college.
Indeed, and I subsequently met him again at Balliol, and we became great friends. He was incredibly encouraging and supportive, and I used to turn pages for his recitals and always receive a very nice little envelope with a fee in it. Even, I suspect, when he hadn't been getting a fee for the recital, but
So you were writing about music, but the BBC hadn't actually been much of an influence. But then I think you started working for the BBC, but by writing for the listener.
yes. I mean, I became more and more interested in the BBC and in broadcasting while I was at Oxford. But what I did immediately after Oxford was to do a year's arts administration course, with the thought of perhaps going into working for a music festival. And then I was starting to pick up freelance reviewing. And the other thing I remember doing in that decade of the 70s was writing biographical notes for the Proms programmes. And I can't remember how that piece of work came my way, but that was a very good training. So it was actually the listener. I started editing the music pages there in the early 80s, after I had been in New York for 3 years writing for the New Yorker. And I came back from that to do the listener, the Times as a regular music critic, and then became editor of Early Music. So all those things coexisted in the 80s and it was a very, very stimulating and enjoyable time. There were very prominent music critics and distinguished music critics then, but not many of them were interested in early music. And this was the real beginning of the early music revival. And I think people who had the main critic jobs on the main papers were a bit baffled as to what was going on with all this Christopher Hogwood, Trevor Pinnock, Andrew Parrott stuff. And so I, with my enthusiasm for that area of the repertory, picked up a lot of reviewing. And that was marvellous experience. And then I was starting to contribute a bit to BBC broadcasts like Music Weekly, Record Review, and that also was, I wasn't very well regarded by the Radio 3 controllers at the time because I was perceived to have a rather squeaky, childish voice. But all the same, I got some work and it was a very good experience.
Right. So you had particular interest in
Yes.
early-ish music, shall we say? But also, were you writing about? This was Squeaky Gate music too, wasn't it? That period.
Yes, I was writing a lot about. I suppose
Glock was there.
I suppose it's fair to say that my musical taste was formed through involvement with early music and involvement with contemporary music, with rather a big gap in the middle, which I am still endeavouring to fill.
Right, and yet you've written a handy guide to Mozart and so on.
Yes,
so
but
you were writing. So you were writing reviews of concerts.
Yes.
Or academic articles.
No, I was entirely writing reviews of concerts because I was not in any sense a music academic. And it is important to put in this bit of the chronology that I then got a job at Radio 3 writing scripts for broadcast, which in those days was a separate little department which the wonderful Derek Cook ran. And as a result of that, Robert Ponsonby, when he was controller of music, asked me completely out of the blue if I would consider writing the history of the BBC Symphony Orchestra for when it was going to be 50 years old in 1980. And I jumped at that, and it was an enormously enjoyable thing to do. I can't imagine, looking back on it, how they thought I knew enough to do it. But the BBC, as you well know, has wonderful archives and wonderful sources of information. And on that basis, I was able to put together what was then my first book. So that was very positive.
What was your connection with the BBC Symphony Orchestra? It's a fascinating orchestra in many ways.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. But my connection with it was no more than being a keen follower of it and reviewer of its concerts. And I think when Robert asked me to write the book, they wanted someone to do that who was not part of the establishment, as it were, but could provide an outside view, but an outside view that was known to be at least in sympathy with the aims of the orchestra. And in terms of the adventurousness of the repertory and the continual innovation of the symphony orchestra, that was absolutely the case.
What would you have said that in those days was the standard of the BBC Symphony Orchestra compared with other notable orchestras like the LSO, for example?
It varied, but at its best, and when I say at its best in my time, that was absolutely the Pierre Boulez years. It could be absolutely superb. And because you not only had the standard of performance that Boulez managed to draw out of them, but you also had the programming where he would put music and contemporary music in such a wonderful context of 20th century masterpieces. And we're looking back at those programs, Debussy, Ravel, Bartok, Stravinsky, no one could put together programs quite as Pierre Boulez did, with the help of William Gluck and Robert Ponsonby and others. So that, I think, was the peak of the BBC Symphony Orchestra work, certainly in those early 70s.
We've also got an interesting thing about the Symphony Orchestra. It was formed after Broadcasting House had opened, and Broadcasting House had the concert hall, but the concert hall was clearly not big enough for an orchestra of the size that was to become.
Well, if you look in the Radio Timeses of the day, you will see exciting previews of Broadcasting House, including the concert hall described as where the nation will hear great symphonic music. But as you rightly say, it became obvious that this was not going to happen. Now, the Symphony Orchestra had used a reportedly rat-infested studio down by Waterloo Bridge before Broadcasting House was built. But when it became clear that the concert hall would be great for some things, including comedy shows and chamber music recitals, it was not going to work for the Symphony Orchestra. That was when the BBC turned its attention to Maida Vale, where there was a skating rink, which was repurposed as a set of studios.
There's some dispute as to whether it was an ice skating rink or a roller skating rink.
Right.
Do you know which? You don't know which.
I don't know. But of course, that's currently a very interesting issue, because the BBC has proposed, and it will happen, that the BBC Symphony Orchestra will move to new facilities in the Olympic Park. But the hope was that then Maida Vale could be redeveloped. However, there are issues with the listing potentially of Maida Vale, because it's a historic space where not only BBC Symphony Orchestra but pop artists, of great renown recorded.
Yes.
So I think that's all a bit up in the air at the moment.
It's one of the few buildings the BBC owns.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Isn't that curious, because it doesn't own Broadcasting House?
I think it thought, being one of the few buildings that it owns, it was one of the few buildings it could sell.
Yeah, so you're writing about them. You're also in a period when the BBC was commissioning a lot of very contemporary, in the sense of extremely contemporary music.
Yes.
Not just the sort of, Benjamin Brittens and Tippets, but Stockhausen or whatever. Yeah. I don't know.
William Gluck did many, many things for the BBC, but one of the things that he did was to really concentrate the commissioning of new music and to make sure that the Proms were the place where those premieres got heard. And so Whereas if you look back in the 50s, the BBC was commissioning symphonies for Cheltenham and, various different strands of commissioning. William made sure that the Proms were the focus, and that was something that was carried on by Robert Ponsonby after him and by John Drummond. And so one really felt that to have a significant amount of commissioning in the season was an essential part of what the Proms were. Because if you go back to Henry Wood, he was importing what he called his novelties, which were often first performances in the UK of music by people like Schoenberg or Debussy or whoever.
Yeah.
So what I think did happen, and I hope happened in my time, was that the base of the kind of music we were commissioning broadened. So it wasn't all in a single mainstream, and this was reflecting the musical taste of the times. It was saying that, the whole strand of John Taverner, Arvo Pärt, Goretzky, that was as valid as the real hard-hitting 12-note tradition.
Yes.
And so I think that it was a very, very creative period in which the whole basis of what new music was and what would appeal to audiences changed very significantly.
I'd like to ask you sometime later what you think the BBC's current obligation is towards serious music, but also to question the word serious and to question the word classical and to question all that. Because it's very difficult, particularly if you find that Apple is now embarking on a new classical music service. And it's, I hope, going to get away from calling everything as a song.
Yes.
And you just have performers and that's it. But it implies that maybe there's a resurgence in interest. I don't know. But anyway, let's come back to...
I fundamentally believe all music is music.
Yes.
And it's not useful to segregate it too much. And one of the things, just to finish off with what we were talking about in terms of changing taste, one of the things is that the genres are being increasingly blurred. And when you look at a composer like Nico Muhly, who is doing a lot in the pop world as well as in the classical world, those things are coming together now. So I think we've got to recognise that the public doesn't necessarily use those descriptors as it used to.
No, but what descriptor would you use if you were talking about what we would consider, quotes, classical music, i.e. Radio 3's output, on the whole? What word do you use?
Well, I think great music is a very good description of what we aspire to. And in terms of Radio 3, it was always great music and culture, because there was always the talks element, the drama element, and so on and so forth. So I think you need to be able to point people in the direction of what they can expect, but not confine it.
Yeah.
If you listen to Radio 3 these days, there's an awful lot on it that wouldn't necessarily, in the past, have been described as classical.
No. It's sort of world music or whatever.
Yes, but even if you think in a narrower way of how the repertory broadens, it took a long time for Gershwin to be recognised as part of a potential Proms repertory.
Yes.
In my day at the Proms, was the first time any Stephen Sondheim had been heard at the Proms, and now that's absolutely, part of the mix.
Let's come back to you and the BBC. When did you decide to become, or when were you invited to become, a member of staff?
Well, the first time that I became a member of staff was, as I described earlier, in the middle of the 70s. I applied for a job writing scripts for Radio 3. And it's quite difficult to remember now that there were such jobs, but the concept was in those days that producers produced programmes, but then they handed it over to a presentation department who wrote scripts for them to be put on the air. And then those scripts were handed over to people who read them. And so these three things had no necessarily direct connection between each other. And it was a very, very weird setup. But anyway, that was what I did mid-70s, but then in 79 I got the chance to go to New York and write for the New Yorker. So I had to leave at that point, and when I came back, all through the 80s I was doing The Listener, I was contributing to programmes, but I wasn't part of the staff.
No, but eventually you were controller Radio 3, so how did that come about?
Well, that's as much a mystery to me as it is to you. This was 92. John Drummond had been doing both Radio 3 and the Proms together for some while, and was then at that point going to give up Radio 3 but carry on with the Proms until the centenary. So to some extent it was rather an unenviable job. The other unenviable aspect of it was that...
Because it was too much of a job,
yes,
too big a job.
Yes. The other unenviable... Well, no, I mean the reverse, that he was keeping the nice bit of the job, running the Proms.
Oh, I see.
And the other unenviable aspect of it was that after much toing and froing, Classic FM was going to come on stream as a commercial classical radio station. And people genuinely thought that would be the end of Radio 3.
Really?
That it might have been decimated. I don't think they really understood what the differences between the two would be at that point. So anyway, I was at the point of having written about things for a long time, feeling I ought to... throw my hat in the ring, sort of as a marker for something that I might do later on. And as it happened, they asked me to do the job. So my enduring memory is, because, I had never run anything at that point beyond a small magazine about early music. And they sent me on a course at the London Business School for new chief executives, all sorts of people. And we all had to describe our situations and where we come from, just like I've done for you. And I always remember the chap who was running the course, after I'd outlined my background and qualifications and so on. He looked at me and he said, "It's a very strange appointment," which wasn't exactly the most reassuring thing you wanted to hear. Anyway, so one learnt by doing and making lots of mistakes, but it was there was very, very talented people in Radio 3. They were beginning to have a more outward-facing approach to the whole thing of music broadcasting. It was very noticeable in the days of the Radio 3 monopoly, how inward-focused they were. There was a lot of infighting going on, whereas now they had to become much more outward-facing towards the audience.
So after it stopped being the third programme and became Radio 3, it became rather incestuous and rather inward-looking, navel-gazing.
Yes. I think it was just one of those things that because there wasn't competition, people were focused on, discussing things among themselves.
Yes.
But that changed. It had to change, and I think the benefits of that are felt today.
So, what was the establishment? What was the size of the staff on Radio 3, do you think?
There were 4 or 5 editors. Mm-hmm. They were the core group, really. I had a very good number 2, Brian Barfield, who dealt with the speech output on the whole and the drama. Editors of opera, new music, and so on and so forth. And then a changing cluster of producers who delivered all these programmes. There was a music department, and there was the symphony orchestra, and there were the regional centres that one had a slightly more hands-off relationship with because they were managed locally in the regions. So it was quite a complex machine.
Yes. You had the symphony orchestra, but elsewhere there were plenty of other BBC orchestras,
There were.
and I think they all survive at the moment.
Or they do, indeed, and flourish. But all I mean is that from the establishment point of view that you were asking about, the BBC Welsh, which became called the National Orchestra of Wales, was essentially part of Wales.
Yes. So you had no responsibility
But
at all.
editorially,
No.
and this was the really driving thing about the changes that John Burt then introduced to the whole commissioning process, the controllers of the networks were in the driving seat as far as the commissioning of the orchestras was concerned. And so it was very important, I think, to the orchestras to have someone who was fundamentally sympathetic to what they were doing at Radio 3 and understood their need to be public orchestras as well as broadcasting orchestras.
So you were protecting them to some extent, were you?
I'm sure. John Burt wouldn't have wanted it stated like that, but from my point of view, I felt I was by commissioning what they did best in as great a quantity as they were able to produce. Yes.
Was John Burt interested in music?
He was interested in making sure that each of the radio networks had a distinctive voice. He wasn't particularly interested in the content, no. I wouldn't say, but he wanted it because he had a very, very astute sense of what government wanted from the BBC. He wanted it to be clear as to why Radio 3 was different from Classic FM, as to why Radio 1 was different from Capital, etc., etc. And so that was really the basis of the strategy that he put together. And I think he was dead right about that.
Distinctiveness, yes.
Yes.
What was your typical day then, when you were running Radio 3? I mean, what were Radio 3 editorial meetings like?
Yes, I think. Well, the what happened was with the introduction of this system, which caused huge alarm and discontent among the production staff, called producer choice. And as I hadn't run any previous system, I was one of the few people who knew how to do it. And of course, it wasn't really producer choice. It was controller choice, because it meant that all those producers who felt that they had, and that what their job gave them was a God-given right to areas of the network to schedule as they wanted, they had to make proposals. They had to submit plans, and those would be judged against what the commissioning people wanted, and to what the growing independent sector of production was able to offer. And that became really quite a big issue because there were very bright people in the independent production sector. And so some of the programs that we originated in the 90s, which are still with us, Michael Barclay's Private Passions, for instance, that has always been an independently produced program. Yes, which he does in a room not unlike this. But so it was a big jolt for production staff to feel that their output was not automatically going to be accepted.
Yes. And they had they had to fight for it because there were people outside banging at the doors.
Yeah, absolutely. But as far as I was concerned, I was very happy to support in-house production because there was a lot of great expertise there. And it really was because we had a strong in-house production team that we were able to do the two things in my Radio 3 years that I was most pleased to have done, which was the big season in 1995 called Fairest Isle, which was a big recap of British music across the centuries. And then following that, Sounding the Century, which was a big recap of 20th century music in the years from 97 up till 99.
Yeah. Now, I have to ask you about this because I was heavily involved. You also had the symphony chorus and the BBC Singers.
Yes.
Now, I think people don't quite understand. The BBC Singers is the only fully professional
Correct.
Group of singers, is it, in the country? Or how would the 16 be, for example? Are they?
The 16, those choirs are not salaried choirs. They may be quite fixed in their persona.
They're
but
professionals, but they're not
yes,
salaried.
exactly.
Yes.
But they're not on the books
Yeah.
in the way that the BBC Singers were. It was perceived, I think, as a threat to the BBC Singers because their expertise, again, was very solidly contemporary in terms of repertory. But they had, again, been an isolated specialist group, and around them were growing up a huge number of choirs and vocal groups, from London Sinfonietta Voices to the 16, and now more recently Tenebrae, Voces 8, you name it. And so the question was, what access to broadcasting should those other groups have alongside the BBC Singers? I think eventually the BBC Singers changed a good deal. They now sound absolutely splendid to me. I wasn't always satisfied with the sound they made back in those days, but it was a gradual process of change.
They were set up really for doing things like the morning service, weren't they?
Yes, although it is true that they did that. That wasn't really the reason they were set up. I mean, they existed in the 30s. They were singing, programs of madrigals and all sorts of repertory.
Yes.
But yes, of course, being part of the morning service was a vital bit there. And then you had the big amateur symphony chorus, which was completely different in complexion and has always been, I think, a fantastic asset.
And a free one.
Yeah.
Well, not quite free.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so now tell me about the on-air presenters in Radio 3, because they are lovely voices in many ways, and one is very fond of them.
Yes.
And of course now you have people like Tom Service, who's a very very interesting character, I think. But where are they recruited from? Who are they?
I made myself very unpopular when I arrived at Radio 3 because, change was in the air, and I established the principle that the people who talked on air ought to be able to talk from a position of knowledge and expertise and enthusiasm. And the traditional Radio 3 announcer was not really in that mould. And so that was quite a painful thing. Some people were able to change, some people weren't, some people left, a new generation came on. But I mean, it's something that has always been an issue in terms of radio as to where presenters come from and how they are nurtured and how they are supported. Yes. I think that the sort of nursery slopes, if you like, were doing items for Music Matters, which was what the Music magazine turned into, the occasional total star like Tom Service who just does it, and that's how he does it. We tried out a raft of presenters around the country when we introduced the programme that still exists, In Tune, in the early evening.
Yes.
That was originally broadcast from the different regional centres. But what happened there was that Sean Rafferty in Northern Ireland did it so much better than anybody that we brought him to London, and indeed he's still there doing it. Yes. So it's one of the great sort of mystery arts, radio presenting.
But they tend to be, ex-journalists, ex-music teachers, academics?
All sorts of different backgrounds. If you think of someone really good at the moment, Sarah Moore Peach was at school with our daughter, and got into presenting that way. I wouldn't like to say that there is a route, no.
no.
Although I think if you talk to the present Radio 3, there are schemes, and they've certainly had talent searches for people at university,
Yeah.
of that sort of, because they've wanted a younger fresher voice.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they're people that know what they're talking about. Is
Yes,
basically
yes.
the crucial thing, and have got a decent microphone
Yes,
voice.
absolutely.
And care about the music they're talking about. Yes, which is interesting because when you go back to your original connection, when you were
Yeah.
employed to write scripts for people, this is exactly what you meant. Somebody else would read them,
Yes.
and they may not even know what they were talking about. They would
Yes,
just read
or,
them.
or they may dislike the way I put things,
Yes,
That's
okay.
it.
Now, you were obviously attending a lot of concerts. I mean, I remember, well, there are two things I remember. Firstly, I remember being in the symphony chorus and having these concerts at the festival hall.
Yes.
With very low audiences.
Yes.
And also, I remember going to the Proms as a sort of, after I left university in the 70s, again with very low audiences, things you wouldn't have now because the audiences are enormous, aren't they? And was that because of the musical? I seem to remember a particular year when there was always, every single concert, there was always a piece of new music. And that was presumably Boulez's period.
Yes. Part of the difficulty with the BBC Symphony Orchestra being at the festival hall was that there was so much competition.
Yeah.
There were too many orchestras at the festival hall chasing roughly the same sort of audience. And so I think it was very difficult for them to make the impact that they deserved to make. And I think things really improved when they went to the Barbican after it opened and played alongside the LSO, and people knew, that these two orchestras were different and doing different things, and that worked well. And as far as the Proms is concerned, I think what William Glock did certainly caused at one point a falling off of audiences, but he, like Henry Wood, wanted to educate the audience, and the fact is that they came back and grew and grew. Also remember that, and this is really down to John Drummond, that was the time when the international orchestras started to appear at the Proms, and that was a real draw for people because it gave it a sense of excitement, a sense of event, and he was able to make that happen in a very, very positive way. And now, the Proms is the place where every orchestra wants to appear.
Yes. Well, let's come on to the Proms then, because you then inherited them from John Drummond.
Yes.
John Drummond was a very, very larger-than-life character, wasn't he, in many ways?
Indeed.
It reminds me of Hugh Weldon,
Yes.
funnily.
Yes.
Yes. Same sort of very large character. But he did a lot of...
It was a BBC type, as we're talking about the BBC. There certainly wasn't. And they all lived in Richmond. But it was by no means, a done deal when I went to the BBC to run Radio 3 that I would go on to run the Proms, but they asked me to do it. There was no process at that point in time. And unlike John Drummond, who ran them both together, I only ran them both together for 18 months. So I found it was just too much.
Just too much,
yes.
Absolutely. Yes. Now, tell us about the Proms. How is it organised? How is it funded?
So the BBC invests money from the licence fee in the running of the Proms because it is a public service to put on those concerts at that high level of quality with that amount of rehearsal and preparation and so on and so forth. And so the Proms has always been one of the key bits of the BBC's cultural patronage, if you like. And that was made explicit, much to some people's regret, when the name used by the BBC started to be the BBC Proms
Not the
rather
Henry
than the
Wood.
Henry Wood Promenade concerts. Although I do remember distinctly observing a prom programme that had been specially printed for Sir Adrian Boult with the title Henry Wood Promenade Concerts on it instead of BBC Proms. So the Proms benefit hugely from the presence of the BBC orchestras, that they are, the BBC Symphony Orchestra is the backbone of the Proms. First night, last night,
Well, about 15 proms,
yes,
probably.
yes.
Yeah.
Although from time to time, and I encouraged this, the BBC Symphony Orchestra would get festival engagements during the summer, Salzburg, Edinburgh, which was great that it was able to do. And then you've got those things, you've got certain fixed points. The National Youth Orchestra always does a concert at the end of its summer course. Yes. Glyndebourne comes in with an opera, and then the rest is pure choreography. And it's run by a very small team. When I started, John's artistic administrator being Stephen Maddock, who runs the CBSO. I worked with him for several years, and then Rosemary Gent, who came from the London Sinfonietta and the LA Philharmonic. And I think the great thing about the Proms is it's not decided by committee, and again, much to some people's dismay, it is the exercise of some personal taste. But it's not the exercise of personal taste in a random and autocratic way, because you're dealing with conductors all the time and working with them on what they want to perform.
Now, I mean, nowadays it would be pretty full most of the time. I don't know, not after COVID, of course.
Yeah, well, that's another matter, yes.
I don't know whether the BBC lost money, whether it's the Albert Hall that lost money during that period. But they're pretty full. The seat prices are quite high at the top end. It's very cheap at the bottom end.
Well, it depends what you mean by quite high. They're not as
50,
high
£60 a seat.
they're not as high as the festival hall would charge for Berlin Phil or Vienna Phil, and probably the Barbican as well. So I think the great thing about the Proms prices is their range.
Exactly.
And the fact that at the bottom end, you can stand and have an extraordinarily good experience in the hall for very little
10
money.
quid or something, whatever it is. Yes. Okay. Now, how long in advance are the programs put together?
An interesting thing was in my very first season that John, and I respect him for this, he didn't, in bringing the 100th season to a close in 95, he didn't plan any of 96. And so it was quite a scramble to get the season that we really wanted in for 96 as my first, although we were able to start in 94 because it was known that I would take over then. But I would say usually it's a couple of years for the big building blocks to go in.
Because you've got to book the foreign orchestras.
Yes.
And they need how many years in
Absolutely.
advance?
Well, again, it came and went, but it was usually a 2 or 3 year cycle.
Yeah.
But one could put in certain fixed points like foreign orchestras and the BBC Symphony Orchestra schedule, and then plan the rest around that. Yes. So there was quite a lot of flexibility, and in some things we're going in very much at the last minute, in the last minute rush to get into the Proms guide before it went to press,
How much would the conductors decide the repertoire?
The absolute principle was that the BBC was promoting the concerts. It wasn't as if conductors and orchestras were coming in to promote themselves. We were promoting the concerts, and therefore, as it were, the last say had to be with us. But as far as possible, we collaborated, negotiated, and not only between us and conductor and orchestra, but also with other touring venues that the conductor and orchestra may have been going to. So it was quite sensitive in terms of the Proms and Edinburgh as to what went first. And I always found that a really enjoyable process, and it enabled you to understand what conductors' likes and dislikes were. There was no point in getting people to conduct stuff they didn't want to conduct,
No.
But I do remember. I remember two interactions. You'll remember Gennady Rozhesvensky.
Absolutely.
And at one point we were in the Bruckner anniversary year. We had persuaded him to conduct Bruckner's Second Symphony, which isn't one of the better known symphonies. And I ran into him at Glyndebourne, and I said, "Oh, we're very much looking forward to Bruckner 2." And he looked at me and said, "Bruckner too long." And the other one was Barenboim, who was, a really key figure in the Proms. He came with Chicago and did this big piece by Harrison Birtwistle that they had commissioned in Chicago called Exody, and Mahler 5. And I thought it was a mad program at the time, but it had the aura of a great event about it. And again, earlier in the year, I ran into Barenboim and I said, "Well, this is selling amazingly well. This is the concert everyone wants to come to." And he stopped and then he said, "Except me." So these were great. They were great times, and it was very creative. And I do think the other thing you're hinting at here is we had extraordinary freedom from the BBC as to what we did.
Yep.
And of course, there would be times when that was called into question or political considerations intervened. That tended to be at moments like 9/11.
Well, I was going to talk about 9/11 because that was a particularly interesting and really rather scary time. And I remember that the schedule had to be completely reorganised between the Monday or the Tuesday.
It was the
Tuesday and the Saturday.
Correct.
Tell us about the panic.
Yes, because on the Tuesday, which was the day of the attack, when we didn't really know what the level of the damage was, how many British people might have been involved, that night Christoph Eschenbach added the funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica to the programme. But as you say, it was the nearness of the last night which was the challenge. And so that was one occasion on which there was quite a lot of consultation around the BBC, because this was going to be on television. There had also been quite a few political hiccups in the week to do with the Americans feeling that the BBC had not been totally supportive of their position. So, and of course we had an American conductor, Leonard Slatkin, for the last night. So my feeling was we just had to take out the anything that could be regarded as the British jingoistic elements, and we had to take out, of course, and for the second time, John Adams's Short Ride in the Fast Machine.
That was incredible. It kept popping up.
It did.
Times.
Yes. I think
it was. Wasn't it
Diana?
Diana's.
Yes. I think he wishes he'd called it something else.
It's actually a rather good piece.
Anyway, the fact was that then we had what I think in retrospect it was the right thing to do. We had Barber's Adagio in the second half as a straight memorial piece. But then we did the last movement of Beethoven 9 as a statement, a statement of bringing humans together in the most positive way. And I think that...
And the Tippett spiritual.
Yes, and the Tippett spirituals from Child of Our Time. And I think all those things together worked pretty powerfully.
Yes.
But, those are the very, very exposed decisions that one makes.
Absolutely. Well, I remember that I was in the symphony chorus for that.
Yes.
And we were aware that Slatkin was very worried about how the promenade would take the, if you like, the reorganised second half, particularly. In the first half, I imagine they would have accepted whatever there was, but it's the second half. And in fact, it turned out to be fine.
Yes, it did.
Of course.
It did. And he did a really excellent job on pulling it together. And we did say something to the audience before the concert started, before it went on the air, about how we had approached it.
Yes.
Just so that people understood. And I also made the point that it was being broadcast to 200 national public radio stations in America. So that was a veiled statement to please not disrupt the mood.
Yes.
And I think the mood really worked. So it was just one of those horrible, horrible things that one had to do, but it just shows it's a very good demonstration of the part that the Proms plays in national life.
Absolutely.
It's beyond it just being a musical occasion.
Yeah. The various orchestras, you presumably had a commitment to use the other orchestras, the Welsh,
Yes.
Scottish.
Yes. It wasn't so much a commitment, it was a wonderful resource because, part of each year's planning would be to sit down and with the conductors of those orchestras and the managers and to say, we're interested in commissioning X, are you interested in doing that? Or they would say, we're interested in commissioning Y, would that be something suitable for the Proms? And then balancing up the programmes because... as we implied earlier, inevitably the touring programmes of the big international orchestras were the most difficult thing to have a big influence on because they were dependent on so many other factors.
Yes.
Whereas the programmes of the BBC orchestras and the symphony orchestra in particular could be done from the ground up.
Yeah.
And that was a really wonderful resource.
Absolutely. No, I still don't quite understand the no, it's all right. I mean, you put it on, it's part of a public service, fine.
Yes.
It's also a commercial venture. It brings in money. It presumably covers its costs.
Why do you say that?
I don't know. I just assume it must.
No. The answer is that to do the Proms on the level that they are done, with the amount of rehearsal that they have, and with the reasonable ticket prices that they have, in my day, that meant the BBC putting in 4 or 5 million to the season.
Really?
Because it was always said that the Proms could acquire a sponsor, but once anybody began to look at the figures, the need, was far beyond most sponsors. Right. And in the end, to do John Burke credit, he totally went against that and said, no, this is something that the BBC does, and the BBC should get the credit for it. And I think that was the right approach. It would be possible, I'm just trying to think this out in the terms of the way you asked the question, it would be possible to have a totally unrehearsed season of popular concerts at the Albert Hall for which you charged a lot of money that just about wash their face. And that's presumably what commercial promoters at the Albert Hall do. But, from the BBC's point of view, one was, in that amount, I'm also talking about paying the BBC orchestras.
Yes.
Reasonable fees, paying them, and promoting and marketing and selling the tickets and paying rental to the Albert Hall.
Yes.
So it's, and you were talking about 70 concerts and more. It's an expensive undertaking.
Yes.
But it was done with real commitment to quality.
Yes. And do you think that commitment still exists?
I'm sure that the commitment of the BBC to the cultural life of the nation still exists. It's a question of to what extent that's reflected in the different activities that it does. And as we know, the BBC is under enormous pressure now in terms of cost, and will have to look very carefully at whether it can continue to maintain the range of activities that it does. And that will be something that will have to involve Radio 3, it'll have to involve the orchestras, it'll have to involve the proms. But I think that the really key thing, which politicians who talk about this regularly fail to understand, to put it mildly, is that the BBC is, in these areas of its activity, more than a broadcaster. It is part of the cultural life of the country. The BBC orchestras play a fantastic role in the nations, regions and London in providing public concerts, which they have done since those orchestras were formed. And I think that obviously the question of whether they give the greatest value for money and are efficiently run and so on needs to be looked at. But I think nobody could be in any doubt as to the artistic benefits of the BBC's orchestras and its concert promotions now.
And that includes commissions. I imagine that the commissions presumably would come out of your budget, out of your Radio 3 budget.
Yes. An interesting thing that happened with commissions was, particularly for the major composers, one had increasingly to look at sharing those between different organisations. But that was a good thing. To be able to commission a Berio or a Birtwistle, it was a good thing that you got 3 or 4 orchestras together to do that, because it meant the piece would be heard.
Yes, and often one wondered about hearing pieces, whether you were ever going to hear them again, particularly the sort of festival hall concerts where there wasn't much of an audience. The appointment of the conductors, who appoints, say, Andrew Davis to become conductor?
Well, I don't think we can be in any doubt other than that John Drummond appointed Andrew Davis.
Right.
I think, like all these things, it became more collaborative. So I think the orchestra had more of a voice than it did in the past. And when you look at a really successful appointment, which I wasn't at all involved with, can't take any credit for, but Zachary Oromo at the BBC Symphony, which has worked out so well both for him and the orchestra, that was something that the orchestra was rock solid behind from the very first moment. Right. So I think these things are collaborative. The managers of the orchestras are the people who have to take the responsibility because they have to look after these conductors, but the proms would want to be involved and so on.
But I mean, you enjoyed doing it, presumably. Was it?
Oh, yes.
Is it the biggest job you've had?
Both Radio 3 and the proms were music-based, and they led on to doing the Barbican, where I was involved with all the art forms. And so that was 365 days of the year, unlike the concentration of the prom season. So in some ways, the Barbican was bigger, but I think the proms, because of broadcasting and because of the BBC, it had that international impact. Yeah. And people around the world knew what the proms were. Yes. Must be said that the Japanese tended to want flags on every night, Yes, quite. But and with that came a responsibility to get it right in terms of the choices that were made.
Yes. Nick, I think we need to stop there.
Well, thank you very much.
I thought it's fantastically interesting, but we've got these personal connections, and it's not just the Balliol thing; it's the symphony chorus and everything else.
Well, it is fantastic. Yes. Well, thank you. Good. It's very enjoyable indeed.
Oh, was it? Oh, that's nice.
Brings it all back.
Brings it all back.